We're now happy to take some questions.
Hi, just going off of the numbers that Mr. Hollier provided, if the rate is currently $189 a day, what does $294 million do to that rate?
Sure. So the rough math is the increase would be approximately $37 additional per day per resident.
37 a day?
30 some, roughly, approximately. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess just on that, 294 seems like an oddly specific number. How did you pull that number?
Sure. So every year CMS comes out with what they call the market basket index that looks at the costs of providing care and how it's rising. So when you look back over the last 7 or 8 years, it's been on average 2.2%. So this increase is roughly in line with that. Also with the recognition, again, that we're not going to be able to address this deficit in one budget. We need to start taking a significant chunk to start closing that gap.
Sorry, it's roughly in line with?
Sorry, CMS basket market index looks at the rising costs of providing nursing care year to year.
And so that 294 represents the increase in 1 year?
No, it looks at the increase over the last 7 or 8 years, on average what it's been, to try to start trying to address that gap.
So is 294 looking at the increase over the last 7 or 8 years?
Correct. What it would have been according to CMS in terms of the rising cost of providing services. And that number was also arrived at in conjunction with, as I mentioned, the other two associations who represent nursing homes.
And it's roughly an inflationary increase year
Correct,
to year?
correct.
That CMS is tracking?
Correct.
Okay.
Have you projected going forward annually how much an increases you would need in order to sustain the level of care that you're saying that this 294 would bring you to?
Sure. So right now, the benchmark report, I think it's important to note, sometimes benchmark reports inflate to the current times. This report was a snapshot in 2019, 2020, but it was not inflated to 2022 or 2021. So it's important to note that. So this is a snapshot in time as in when they looked at the Medicaid cost reports during that time period of what that gap is. And now we know with the pandemic, costs have continued to rise and have increased substantially. So, if you do the report to reflect the more recent time bringing us up to the current period, that number would be even larger. The gap continues to grow and has just exacerbated during the pandemic.
So you can't really project going forward annually what your cost increases are going to be?
It's difficult right now just because, we're in the new normal with the cost of the pandemic and it's uncertain. We've seen some one-time funding from the federal government come through, which has been helpful, but it's not sustaining. So providers going forward are going to have to pick up a lot of those additional costs. And that's, where some of the question marks remain. But we know the costs are going to continue to rise in significant ways.
But a couple people mentioned wings closing and things like that. Do we know how widespread that is, or is it still at this point kind of sporadic, or is it everyone's closing wings? Can you speak to sort of how prevalent that is?
Sure. No, I've been with Leading Age, like I said, for about a month now, and I've heard it from a number of members. And also, too, recently there was the Jewish home in Harrisburg that was forced to close, not forced to close, I should say, to sell to an out-of-state real estate company because their funding gap per day was $100 per resident. We are seeing nursing homes having to take beds offline, especially when during the peak of the pandemic, hospitals needed to discharge residents and there just wasn't the beds because of the workforce issue. Just as a side note, I worked for the administration and oversaw the Pennsylvania Long-Term Care Council. Back in 2019, we issued a report, a blueprint for strengthening Pennsylvania's direct care workforce. That report had recommendations in it for addressing what was then a worsening crisis going back decades. Been a number of reports. I never would have thought would be standing here after 2 years of a global pandemic, having to, again, beg to address this funding gap so providers have the workforce they need. Not only the workforce, but workers, who are able to stay in that profession to serve our most vulnerable citizens. If now is not the right time to do it, then, I don't know when is. We're at the most critical stage, we've ever been in. And again, this is not a new issue. It's been, a crisis before the pandemic, and it's only gotten much worse.
If you're saying that the loss is roughly $134, at least in 2021, $134 per resident per day, and the current rate is $189, does that mean that an adequate reimbursement is somewhere around $320, $325 a day?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly on the numbers, but we could get back to you on that.
Just a comment on the SHPOs. You asked about the closing of wings. I'm one of the Lancaster Area Senior Service Provider members. There's 17 of us. And I think it's fair to say that nearly every single one has wings that are offline right now. Pleasant View had 5 wings about 4 years ago. We have taken off 1 wing, decertified those beds, and we have another wing completely offline, and we're considering a third. And that would bring us to about 68 beds from 133. And that's not an uncommon theme in the county.
You have 68 service or 68 off?
We currently have about 92 in service, but we're considering taking another 20 or more off, bringing it down to the 60.
Maybe I'll elaborate a little bit on that. I'll echo those comments. I don't know a single provider, quality provider, committed to providing care to seniors who can't afford to pay privately for that care that aren't considering some reduction in the number of medical assistance beds that they serve. Not one. We have 453 beds of skilled nursing in our Elizabethtown facility, licensed beds. And a large provider with, as I mentioned, a long history. About 70% of those beds are occupied by medical assistance residents. And right now, we're serving about 340 residents because of workforce shortage related issues. And it's simply not sustainable for us or many other providers looking into the future to be able to serve 453 residents in our skilled nursing facility. So we are, this is a real problem. And as I said, I don't know a single provider, quality providers. These aren't profiteers that are looking to make money on the medical assistance reimbursement rates. I assure you of that. These are people that are fighting to survive, to fulfill a mission of caring for as many seniors without regard to their ability to pay as possible.
And, I'm sorry, one other question.
Sure.
It sounds like your impression from the administration is that the $91 million increase that they're proposing in the rate is tied to providers agreeing to or some sort of passage of legislation that would require a particular staffing ratio.
Correct. So,
That's your impression from them?
yeah, so currently,
How did they give you that impression? Is that on a,
Sure.
Is there a document? Did they tell you that verbally?
yeah, it's in the administration's budget proposal documents. So, and that's tied, currently, the Pennsylvania Department of Health has a regulatory proposal to increase to 4.1 hours. And in the governor's budget proposes, I believe it's $91.25 million. And in the budget documents, it talks about that is to get nursing homes to increase their staffing with regards to the proposal. The issue with that is it ignores the workforce crisis. It ignores the fact that providers have been underfunded historically and systemically. And it's also their estimation with their budget proposal is woefully inadequate. Woefully, in our comments to the Independent Regulatory Review Committee, as well as other commentators, and even the Independent Regulatory Review Committee themselves, they asked the Department of Health to justify, the impacted costs. Because in looking at what their projections are, we do not believe it fully takes into account what the impact of going to 4-1 would be on our providers. And this is in addition to the current shortfall we're talking about.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Any other questions? All right, thank you, everyone.